Whoever films the freak crying first drinks are on me. Brett Sullivan said it loud, laughing, pointing across the break room at the quiet waitress scrubbing dishes with her back turned. That mute regular in the private room, he won't answer anybody, and the Ice Queen barely talks either. So let's send the freak to serve the freak and watch her fall apart. The whole staff roared. Phones came out. Nobody noticed Tessa Walker's hands had gone still in the sink or that she'd heard every word. They thought they were about to break her. They had no idea she was about to change everything. Before we go on, if stories about quiet strength and unexpected kindness move you, please subscribe and stay to the very end, because this one turns in ways you will not see coming. And do me one favor, comment the name of the city where you're watching from right now so I can see just how far Tessa's story travels tonight. Tessa Walker had learned a long time ago that the quietest people in a room usually carry the heaviest things. She was 27 years old, and she had been carrying for as long as she could remember. The restaurant was called Belvedere, and it sat on the kind of Chicago street where the valets wore gloves and the wine cost more than Tessa made in a week. She had worked there for 3 years. In 3 years, she had never once been late, never once called in sick, never once let a plate leave her station cold. And in 3 years, not a single coworker had bothered to learn one true thing about her. They thought they knew her. They called her the mute one, the Ice Queen, the girl who never smiled. They said it in the break room like it was a joke everyone was in on. They said it loud enough for her to hear, which was the whole point. What none of them knew was that Tessa spoke plenty. Just not to them. Every night after the last table cleared and the last dollar was counted, she went home to a cramped apartment on the far west side, sat on the edge of a twin bed, and practiced American Sign Language until her fingers ached. She practiced for one reason, and his name was Daniel. Daniel was 17. He had been deaf since a fever took his hearing at the age of 4, back when their mother was still alive and still pretending everything was fine. Tessa had raised him more than their mother ever had. She had held him through the silent nightmares he could not scream out of. She had fought the school board when they tried to shove him into a classroom with no interpreter. She had signed his first joke, his first insult, his first, "I love you." And every extra hour she worked every double shift that left her feet bleeding inside her cheap black shoes was a brick in the wall she was building to keep that boy safe. So when Brett Sullivan smirked at her across the floor that Thursday night and said, "Table 9's yours, sweetheart," Tessa did not know she was walking into a trap. She only knew that Brett smiled like that when something was about to go wrong for someone who wasn't Brett. "Table 9, she repeated, keeping her voice flat. She had learned to keep her voice flat around men like Brett. It gave them nothing to grab. "That's the private room." "Sure is." Brett leaned against the server station arms, crossed that grin stretching wider. "Big spender back there, regular, you'll love him." Behind Brett, 3 of the other servers had suddenly found reasons to linger nearby. Marcus was pretending to polish glasses. Chelsea had her phone half out of her apron pocket. Owen, the new busboy, stood off to the side, looking like a man who wanted to be anywhere else. Tessa felt the weight of their attention settle on her shoulders like a wet coat. "Who is he?" she said. It wasn't really a question. Brett's grin flickered. "Salvatore Marino." The name meant nothing to Tessa. But she watched the way Marcus's hands went still on the glass, the way Chelsea's eyes darted up, and she understood that it meant plenty to everyone else. "Should I know him?" she asked. Chelsea laughed a sharp little sound. "Oh, honey, you're gonna find out." Tessa looked from face to face. She had spent her whole life reading people who couldn't or wouldn't speak, and these 3 were shouting without saying a word. Something was wrong. Something was being done to her right here in the open, and she was expected to walk into it smiling. "What's the joke?" she said quietly. "No joke," Brett said way too fast. "Just do your job, unless you can't handle it." He let the words hang there a dare with a hook in it. "Maybe I misjudged you. Maybe you're not tough enough for the good tables. Maybe I should give the private room to someone who can actually work it." And there it was. The thing Brett always did. He wrapped the cruelty in a challenge so that if you refused, you looked weak, and if you accepted, you walked straight into whatever he'd built for you. Tessa had watched him do it to a dozen people. She had promised herself she would never let him do it to her. But she needed this table. Private room meant high spender meant a tip that might cover Daniel's speech therapy for the month. And there was something else, something older and harder, buried under the exhaustion. Tessa Walker did not break in front of people who wanted to watch her break. "Fine," she said. "Table 9. The grin came back to Brett's face like a light switching on. "Atta girl," she heard Chelsea whisper. "This is going to be so good," as she walked away, and she pretended she hadn't. The private room at Belvedere was at the back past the kitchen, behind a heavy oak door that muffled the noise of the floor. Tessa stopped outside it with her order pad in her hand and her heart going faster than she wanted it to. She did not know yet what waited on the other side. She only knew that a room full of people were hoping she would humiliate herself in the next 10 minutes, and that they were probably filming, and that the only thing worse than failing would be letting them see it land. She took a breath. She pushed the door open. The man at the table did not look up. He sat alone, a big man in a dark suit that fit him the way expensive things fit expensive people. His hair was gray at the temples. His hands rested flat on the white tablecloth, still patient, like a man who had spent his life waiting for other people to make the first move. There was a bottle of red wine on the table untouched. There was a folded newspaper he wasn't reading. Tessa walked to the table. "Good evening, sir. My name is Tessa. I'll be taking care of you tonight." He didn't respond. She waited. Nothing. The man kept his eyes down, studying the tablecloth, as if it held something more interesting than she did. Out in the hallway, she was almost certain she could feel the pressure of people crowded near the door, listening. "Sir," she said a little louder, "can I start you off with anything, or would you like a few minutes with the menu?" Still nothing. Not a flicker. And that was the moment Tessa understood the joke. They hadn't sent her back here to serve a difficult customer. They'd sent her back here to serve a man who could not hear her. A man they'd probably watched ignore or dismiss a dozen servers before her. They wanted her to stand there talking to a wall, growing more flustered by the second, until she gave up and fled the room red-faced while they laughed into their phones. The mute girl and the man who won't answer. A perfect, cruel little show. The rage that went through her was so sudden and so complete that for a moment she couldn't move. Not rage at the man, rage at Brett, at Chelsea, at every person who had ever decided her silence made her a target. Rage at a world that thought the quiet ones were quiet because they had nothing inside them. And then slowly the rage folded itself into something else, something that felt almost like recognition. Because Tessa knew this. She knew exactly what she was looking at. She had spent 13 years learning to look at it. The man wasn't rude. The man wasn't ignoring her. The man simply had not heard a single word she'd said, and he had no way of knowing she'd been speaking at all. Tessa set her order pad down on the empty chair beside her. She stepped closer into the edge of his vision so that he would have to notice the movement. And when his eyes lifted, wary and guarded, meeting hers for the first time, she raised her hands. She signed slowly, clearly. "Good evening. My name is Tessa. Are you deaf?" For a long moment, nothing happened. The man went completely still. His eyes moved from her hands to her face and back to her hands, and something crossed his expression that Tessa would think about for a long time afterward. It was not surprise exactly. It was the look of a man who had been walking through the dark for years and had just seen impossibly a light. His hands came up off the tablecloth. They were huge hands scarred across the knuckles, and they moved with a rough kind of care, like a man handling something he was afraid of dropping. "Yes," he signed back. "I am deaf. You sign." "I sign," Tessa answered. "Why?" She hesitated. It was such a simple question and such a complicated answer. "My brother," she signed finally. "He's deaf. I learned for him." The man stared at her. And then, for the first time, something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the distant cousin of a smile, the kind of expression that showed up on a face that had forgotten how. "Sit," he signed. Tessa's heart lurched. "Sir, I can't. I'm working. If I sit with a guest, I could lose my job." His hands stilled. He studied her, and there was something shrewd in it now, something that saw more than she wanted seen. "The people at the door," he signed. "They sent you here to laugh at me." Tessa's breath caught. She had not expected him to know, but of course he knew. A deaf man in a hearing world learns to read. The whole room learns to catch the sideways glances, and the covered mouths learns the shape of a joke he cannot hear the words of. He had probably known the second she walked in what she'd been sent to do. She could lie. She could smooth it over, protect the restaurant, protect her job. That was the smart thing. Yes, she signed instead. I think they did. The man nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd stopped bothering to feel angry about a long time ago. And now, he signed, you are the only one who has ever spoken to me in this room. Tessa didn't know what to say to that, so she signed the only true thing she had. I'm sorry they treat you that way. He tilted his head. You are the one they sent to be humiliated, and you are sorry for me. Put like that, it sounded almost absurd. Tessa felt her throat tighten. I know what it's like, she signed, to be in a room full of people and have every one of them decide who you are before you open your mouth. Something changed in the man's face. The guardedness cracked just slightly, just enough to see through. He looked at her the way people look at a thing they thought didn't exist. What is your name again? He signed. Tessa Walker. Salvatore. He touched his own chest. You may call me Sal. No one calls me Sal. Out in the hallway, Tessa heard a burst of confused whispering. She could imagine it perfectly. They'd expected her to be out of the room by now, humiliated, defeated. Instead, she was still in there, and whatever was happening on the other side of that door, it wasn't the show they'd bought tickets for. Salvatore's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to her, and this time the smile made it all the way to the surface. They are confused, he signed. They do not understand what is happening. No, Tessa signed. They don't. Good. He gestured again at the chair. Then let them be confused a little longer. Sit. 1 minute. If your manager comes, I will tell him I demanded it. He will not argue with me. Tessa should have said no. Every rule in the building said no. But she was so tired, and it had been so long since anyone had looked at her like she was a person instead of a punchline. And there was something in the way this frightening, gentle stranger held out his rough hands toward the empty chair that made the word no impossible to find. She sat. She would look back on that decision for the rest of her life. It was the moment everything changed, though she didn't know it yet. She didn't know who Salvatore Marino was. She didn't know what he could do, or what had been done in his name, or the storm that was already gathering behind the walls of his quiet, careful world. She only knew that for the first time and longer than she could remember, she was talking to someone. Really. Talking hands flying, and neither of them was pretending to be anything they weren't. Tell me about your brother, Salvatore signed. And Tessa did. It came pouring out of her in a way it never came out to hearing people, because with them there was always the effort of translating herself, always the wall of her own careful quiet. But her hands knew Daniel by heart. She told Salvatore about the fever, about the years of fighting the school, about the night Daniel came home with a black eye because some kid had decided a deaf boy was an easy target and Daniel had proven him wrong. She told him about the double shifts, about the medical debt that followed her like a shadow, about the way she counted every dollar twice. Salvatore watched her hands the whole time. He didn't interrupt. When she finally stopped, embarrassed at how much she'd said, he was quiet for a long moment. Your brother, he signed, is lucky. Tessa shook her head. He's not. He's had a hard life. He has a hard life, Salvatore corrected. And a sister who spends her nights learning his language so he is never alone in a room. That is more than most people get. That is more than I got. The way he signed the last 3 words, something behind them, made Tessa go still. You, she signed carefully. Did you have someone? For the first time, Salvatore looked away. His hands settled back onto the tablecloth. When he lifted them again, they moved slower. I lost my hearing when I was 9, he signed. Not a fever. A man hit me. Here. He touched the side of his head. After that silence, my family did not learn to sign. They spoke around me, over me, about me. I learned to read faces because it was the only way to know if I was safe. I have been reading faces for 40 years. He paused. You are the first person in a long time whose face I did not have to read, because you simply told me the truth. Tessa felt something crack open in her chest. She had walked into this room braced for cruelty and found instead a man who had been lonelier than she was. Two people the world had decided to talk around, finally talking to each other. "Sir," she signed, and then corrected herself with a small smile. "Sal, I really do have to go back to work. If I don't, I'll get in trouble and I need this job. I need it badly." Salvatore nodded slowly. He understood need. She could see that he understood it. But before she stood, his hands came up one more time. "Come back," he signed. "Next Thursday. I come here every Thursday. Same room, same time. I have come here every Thursday for 2 years and sat alone. Come back, and I will not be alone." Tessa hesitated. It was a strange request from a strange man, and every instinct she'd built up over a hard life told her to be careful. But she looked at his face, and she didn't have to read it because he'd handed her the truth the same way she'd handed him hers. He wasn't asking for anything but company. He was asking not to be talked around. "Okay," she signed. "Next Thursday." She stood, picked up her order pad, and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the heavy oak and glanced back. Salvatore had picked up his newspaper again, the picture of a man dining alone, but there was something different in the set of his shoulders now, something less heavy. Tessa pushed the door open and stepped back out into the noise of the floor. They were waiting for her. Of course they were. Brett stood dead center, arms crossed, that grin already loaded and ready to fire. Chelsea had her phone up filming. Marcus and 2 others hung back smirking. Owen the busboy stood at the very edge of the group with his eyes on the floor. "Well," Brett said loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. "How'd it go with the freak? He talked to you. He talked to anybody." Tessa looked at him. She looked at the phone in Chelsea's hand. She looked at the little half circle of people who had spent the last 20 minutes hoping she'd come out crying. And she felt something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. She felt like she'd won. "He was lovely," she said. The grin on Brett's face flickered. "What? He was lovely," Tessa repeated calmly. "We had a nice conversation. He asked me to come back next week." The silence that followed was worth more to Tessa than any tip. Chelsea's phone drooped in her hand. Marcus's smirk fell right off his face. And Brett for one glorious second looked like a man who had set a trap and heard it snap shut on empty air. "That's not," Brett started. "That's not possible. He doesn't talk to anybody. He can't even hear you. You're lying." "I'm not lying," Tessa said. "I have tables to check." And she walked past him, past all of them, her chin up and her hands steady, leaving Brett Sullivan standing in the middle of his own failed joke. But Tessa was not naive. She had lived too hard a life to believe that walking away clean was the same as walking away safe. She could feel Brett's eyes drilling into her back as she moved across the floor, and she knew the way you know weather is coming, that she had just made an enemy of a man who did not forgive being made a fool of. She was right. Brett Sullivan did not laugh it off. He couldn't. He had built his little kingdom at Belvedere on being the guy who ran the games, the guy nobody crossed, and Tessa Walker had just walked into his best joke and walked out having beaten it. Worse, she'd done it in front of everyone. In front of the phones. The clip Chelsea had been so eager to record didn't show a humiliated waitress at all. It showed a strange, dangerous man asking a quiet girl to come back. It showed Brett looking stupid. By the end of the night, the story had already started to twist. Tessa caught the edges of it as she moved through her shift. The whispers weren't about Salvatore anymore. They were about her. You hear she was in there 20 minutes? With Marino, what's she after? Come on, girl like that. She knows exactly what she's doing. Tessa's stomach turned. She understood with a sick clarity what was happening. Brett couldn't beat her with the truth, so he was building a lie. If he couldn't make her the fool, he'd make her the schemer. The gold digger, the girl working an angle on a dangerous man. And in a place like Belvedere where reputation was currency, a lie like that could cost her everything. She found Owen by the dish pit near the end of the night, scraping plates, his shoulders hunched. "Owen," she said quietly. He flinched like she'd caught him at something. "Tessa." "Hey." "You were there," she said, "when Brett set it up, in the break room." Owen's jaw worked. He was young, maybe 19, still new enough to feel bad about things, but not brave enough to do anything about them. "I didn't say anything to him," he mumbled. "I didn't laugh. You didn't stop it either." Owen looked away. It's not that simple. Brett runs the schedule. He runs everything back here. You cross him, you're gone, or he makes your life hell until you quit. You've seen it. You've seen what he did to Renata, to Cole. I got rent, Tessa. I got a kid on the way. He swallowed. I'm sorry. For what it's worth. I'm sorry. Tessa looked at him for a long moment. She recognized the fear in him because it was the same fear that lived in her, the fear of the person who holds your paycheck deciding you're inconvenient. She wasn't angry at Owen. Owen was just another person Brett had backed into a corner. It's all right, she said. But Owen, he's not going to stop with me. Guys like Brett never stop with just one person, you know that. Owen didn't answer. But something moved behind his eyes, some small, stubborn seed of a thing that might, given time and the right push, grow into courage. That night, Tessa rode the bus home with her feet throbbing and her mind spinning. She let herself into the dark apartment as quietly as she could and found Daniel asleep on the couch, a textbook open on his chest, the TV still on with the captions running. She stood over him for a minute, just watching him breathe. 17 years old. Almost a man. Still to her the little boy she'd carried out of the silence. She reached down and gently shook his shoulder. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, then found her face. He smiled, the sleepy smile she loved more than anything in the world. You're late, he signed. Long shift, she signed back. Go to bed, real bed. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. Then he looked at her more closely in the way that only Daniel could, the way that saw straight through the flat mask she wore for the rest of the world. Something happened, he signed. Your face is different. Tessa hesitated. She thought about the private room, about the huge, scarred hands moving with such careful gentleness, about a man who had spent 40 years reading faces to know if he was safe telling her she was the first person he didn't have to read, about the name the whole restaurant said in a hush, Salvatore Marino. I met someone tonight, she signed. A customer. He's deaf like you. We talked for a while in sign. Daniel's whole face lit up. A deaf customer at the fancy restaurant. What's he like? Tessa opened her mouth, then closed it. What was he like? That was the question, wasn't it? He was kind, and he was lonely, and he was frightening, and there was a whole world behind his eyes that she had only glimpsed the edge of. She thought about the whispers. She thought about the way Chelsea and Marcus had gone still at his name. She thought about the fact that she still had no idea what Salvatore Marino actually did, only that grown men were afraid of him. He's kind, she signed finally. I think he's kind. But even as she signed it, a small, cold voice in the back of her mind asked the question she wasn't ready to answer. If he's so kind, why is everyone so afraid of him? And what happens to Brett Sullivan now if a man like that decides he doesn't like the way you've been treated? She pushed the thought down. She sent Daniel to bed. She washed her face and lay down on her own thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. And for the first time in months, the last thing she thought about before sleep took her was not the debt or the bills or the exhaustion. It was a pair of rough hands moving slowly across a white tablecloth telling her the truth. Thursday could not come fast enough. And Tessa did not yet understand that the next Thursday and every Thursday after would pull her deeper into a world she couldn't see the bottom of. She didn't know that Brett was already on the phone spreading his lie. She didn't know that somewhere across the city, in a quiet office with no music playing, Salvatore Marino had asked one of his men a single question. The manager at Belvedere, the loud one. Find out about him. She didn't know that a machine had just started turning silent and patient and absolute, and that she was standing right in the middle of it. All she knew lying there in the dark was that for 1 hour on one Thursday night, she had not been invisible. Someone had seen her. Someone had spoken her language, and whatever it cost her, and it would cost her, she already knew she was going to go back. Because Tessa Walker had spent her whole life being talked around. And she had just met the one man in the world who talked to her instead. The week between Thursdays felt like the longest week of Tessa Walker's life, and it started going wrong before her next shift even began. She'd barely clocked in that Monday when Chelsea cornered her by the lockers with 3 other servers hovering behind her like a jury. So, Chelsea said, arms crossed, you gonna tell us the truth, or you gonna keep playing innocent? The truth about what? Tessa said, not looking up from her apron strings. About Marino. About what you're doing with him. Chelsea's voice dropped into something that pretended to be concern. Because Brett says you've been talking to him for weeks, says you knew exactly who he was before you ever went in that room, says you set the whole thing up so you'd look like the victim. Tessa's hands went still on the apron. That's a lie. Is it? Chelsea tilted her head. Because a girl who never says 2 words to anybody suddenly spends 20 minutes alone with the most dangerous man in the city and comes out saying he's lovely. Come on, Tessa. Nobody's that quiet by accident. You're working an angle. Everybody sees it. And there it was. The lie already had roots. It had grown over a single weekend fed by Brett in the break room and in the parking lot and in whatever group chat these people used to tear each other apart. Tessa understood in that moment that the truth didn't matter anymore. Brett had gotten to the story first, and the story he'd told was uglier and more interesting than hers, and people always believed the uglier one. I'm not working anything, Tessa said quietly. I served a customer. I did my job. Sure you did. Chelsea's smile was thin and cold. Just be careful, sweetie. Girls who play with fire around men like that, they get burned. Or worse. She let the word hang there, then turned and walked off the other servers, trailing after her, already whispering. Tessa stood alone by the lockers with her heart pounding. She wanted to scream. She wanted to grab Chelsea by the shoulders and tell her that she'd learned to sign for a deaf little boy who cried in silence, that she'd never worked an angle on anybody in her life, that the only thing she was guilty of was being kind to a lonely man everyone else was too scared to look at. But she knew it wouldn't matter. She'd learned a long time ago that explaining yourself to people who'd already decided who you were just gave them more rope. So she said nothing. She tied her apron, and she went to work. Brett found her 20 minutes into the shift. He didn't corner her the way Chelsea had. He just drifted up beside her at the server station while she was ringing in an order and spoke low so no one else could hear. You embarrassed me the other night, he said. Tessa kept her eyes on the screen. I did my job. You made me look stupid in front of my whole floor. His voice was calm, almost pleasant, and that was worse than if he'd shouted. You think I'm going to forget that? You think that goes away? He leaned in a little closer. Here's how this works. Walker, I control the schedule. I control the sections. I control whether you go home with $100 or 12. You want to keep playing games with your Mafia boyfriend, that's your funeral. But the second you cost me, you're done. I'll bury you so deep in double shifts and dead sections you'll quit before you even see it coming. You understand me? Tessa finally turned and looked at him. And what she saw in Brett Sullivan's face was not strength. It was fear dressed up as power. He was afraid of her, afraid of what had happened in that room, afraid that for one night he hadn't been the one holding all the cards. She'd seen that look before on schoolyard bullies and drunk customers, and every small man who'd ever tried to make himself feel big by making someone else feel small. I understand you, she said. Good. He straightened up. Now go take table 14. They've been sitting 5 minutes. She went. But something had shifted in her chest, hard and cold and certain. She'd spent 3 years keeping her head down at this place, taking whatever Brett dished out, telling herself it was worth it for the paycheck. She wasn't sure she could keep doing that anymore, not now that she knew what it felt like to sit across from someone who saw her. That night, riding the bus home, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her swipe. It wasn't a call, it was a text. Miss Walker, my name is Vincent. I work for Mr. Marino. He asked me to make sure you received your gratuity from Thursday. It was left with the restaurant, but he was concerned it might not reach you directly. Below it was a second message. He also wished me to say he looks forward to Thursday. Tessa stared at the screen. Her hands had gone cold. It wasn't the message itself. It was what it meant. It meant that a man she'd spoken to for 20 minutes had people. It meant he'd noticed her, remembered her thought about whether Brett would skim her tip, and sent someone named Vincent to handle it. It meant that the quiet, lonely man in the private room could reach across the whole city and touch her life whenever he wanted. She should have been afraid. Part of her was. But another part, the part that was so tired of being invisible, felt something warm move through the fear. Someone had made sure she got paid. Someone had cared enough to check. She texted back a single word. Thank you. Then she turned off her phone before she could talk herself into or out of anything else. At home, Daniel was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with his homework spread out in front of him. He looked up when the light of the hallway hit him, and his face broke into the smile that always undid her. "You're not going to believe my day," he signed. "Tell me," she signed, back dropping into the chair across from him. "Mr. Alvarez said there might be a spot in the summer ASL program at the community college. The real one, with deaf instructors. He said I could apply." Daniel's hands were flying now faster than she could remember seeing them, lit up with a hope she hadn't seen in him in a long time. "There's other deaf kids there, Tess. A whole community. He said I'd fit right in." Tessa's throat tightened. She knew what that program cost. She knew it down to the dollar because she'd looked at it a year ago and closed the browser tab and told herself, maybe someday. There was no room in the budget for it. There was barely room in the budget for the electricity. "That sounds amazing," she signed carefully. Daniel's face changed. He'd caught it, the hesitation, the thing behind her words. He was too smart, too used to reading her. "It costs money," he signed. It wasn't a question. "It's okay, I know we can't. I just wanted to tell you. It's okay, Tess. Really." And that was the thing that nearly broke her. Not that they couldn't afford it, but that Daniel at 17 had already learned to shrink his own dreams before she could, to say it's okay, before she had to be the one who said no. He'd learned to protect her from the pain of disappointing him. No kid should have to learn that. "We'll figure it out," she signed. "I mean it. You apply, we'll figure out the money." "Tessa." "I mean it, Daniel." She reached across the table and took his hands in hers, stopping them, holding them. "You've spent your whole life fitting yourself into rooms that weren't built for you. You deserve one room that is. We'll figure it out." He looked at her for a long moment, and his eyes were wet, and then he nodded. That night, after he'd gone to bed, Tessa sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and a calculator and did the math 3 different ways, and every way it came out impossible. The program cost $1,800. She had $211 to her name and a medical bill due in 2 weeks. She put her head down on the table and let herself cry for exactly 1 minute. Then she wiped her face, closed the notebook, and went to bed. Crying was a luxury she budgeted the same as everything else. Thursday came slow, and then all at once. She'd worked herself into knots over whether Brett would even let her serve the private room again, but when she arrived that evening, the section assignment was already posted, and there it was in Brett's own handwriting. Table 9, Walker. She stared at it confused, until she understood. Brett wasn't giving her the table as a kindness. He was giving it to her so he could watch, so he could gather more ammunition for his lie, so he could point and say, "See, look at her running back to him." What did I tell you? Let him watch, Tessa thought. And she pushed open the heavy oak door. Salvatore was already there. He looked up the second she entered, and this time there was no wary guardedness, no waiting to be humiliated. This time his whole face opened when he saw her, and he lifted his hands before she'd even reached the table. "You came back," he signed. "I said I would," she signed. "People say many things." He gestured at the chair across from him, the same chair. "Sit, please, 2 minutes. Then I will order something expensive and slow, so you have a reason to keep coming back to the table." Tessa laughed before she could stop herself. It surprised her, the laugh, the way it came out easy and real. She couldn't remember the last time laughing had felt like that. She glanced at the door, thought about Brett, thought about the whispers, and then she sat down anyway. If they were going to lie about her regardless, she might as well have the one true thing. "How is your brother?" Salvatore signed. "Daniel." She was startled that he remembered the name. "He's good. Actually, he got some good news." And then, because his face was open and patient and asking, she told him. About the summer program, about the deaf instructors and the community, and the way Daniel's whole face had lit up. And then, because she was so tired of carrying it alone, she told him the other part too. About the $1,800 she didn't have. Salvatore listened, the way he always listened, completely still watching her hands, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. Then he signed something that made her stomach drop. "I will pay for it." "No." She signed it fast, sharp. "No, Sal, no. That's not why I told you." "I know it is not why you told me." His hands were calm. "That is exactly why I offered. If you had asked, I would wonder. You did not ask. You told me about your brother's joy and your own worry in the same breath because you cannot separate them. Let me do this. It is nothing to me. It is everything to him." And that right there was the moment Tessa understood exactly how dangerous this man was to her. Not because he could hurt her, because he could help her, because he could reach into her life and lift the weight she'd been carrying alone for so long, and God, how she wanted to let him. It would be so easy. $1,800. Nothing to him, everything to Daniel. "I can't," she signed, and it physically hurt to sign it. "Sal, please understand. If I take money from you, then everything they're saying about me becomes true. That I'm using you, that I'm after your money. I can't. Not because I don't want to help Daniel, because I have to be able to look at myself." Salvatore studied her for a long time, and then something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like grief, or maybe recognition. "You know who I am," he signed. "What they say I am." Tessa's heart began to pound. "I know what people whisper. I don't know what's true." "Ask me," he signed. "Ask me and I will tell you the truth. I owe you that much. You are the only person who has told me the truth in this room, so I will tell you the truth back, even if it makes you leave." The whole room seemed to go silent. Tessa's hands hovered in the air. She'd wanted to ask this question since the moment she'd walked out of that room a week ago, since the whispers, since the way grown men flinched at his name. And now he was offering, and she was terrified of the answer. "Are you," she signed and stopped and started again. "The things they say, about the criminal world, about you being connected to it, are they true?" Salvatore did not look away. That was the thing she'd remember. He held her eyes and he lifted his hands and he told her. "Yes," he signed. "Some of it is true. I came up in a world you would not recognize, in a family that did things I will not describe to you across a dinner table. I have done things I cannot undo. Men are afraid of me because they have reasons to be afraid of me. That is the truth, Tessa. I will not soften it, and I will not pretend to be a good man who is misunderstood." Tessa's blood had gone cold. Every instinct she'd built over a lifetime of danger was screaming at her to get up, to walk out, to protect herself and Daniel and the small, careful life she'd built. This was exactly the man the whispers had promised. Dangerous, connected, real. But he wasn't finished. His hands kept moving. "And also this is true," he signed. "I have been trying for 3 years to step out of that world. It is not simple. You do not resign from what I was born into. But I have been pulling myself out of it inch by inch, and it is the loneliest thing I have ever done, because when you leave that world, the people in it stop trusting you, and the people outside it never trusted you to begin with. So I sit here every Thursday alone, a man between two worlds belonging to neither." He paused, until a waitress signed to me and asked if I was deaf. Tessa didn't move. She didn't know what to do with any of it, the honesty of it, the enormity of it. She'd asked for the truth, and he'd handed it to her, all of it, the terrible and the human, and now she had to decide what to do with a truth that heavy. "Why are you telling me this?" she signed finally. "Because you will not take my money," he signed, and there was something almost like a smile in it. "Because you would rather carry the weight yourself than owe me anything. Do you know how rare that is in my life? Everyone who comes near me wants something. Everyone. You are the first person in longer than I can remember who wanted nothing from me except that I not be alone at a table. That is why I am telling you the truth, because you have earned it." Out in the hallway, the oak door muffled the sound, but Tessa could still feel it, the presence of people. Brett, watching, waiting, building his lie one Thursday at a time. And here she sat across from a man who'd just confessed to being everything the whispers said, and more, and she couldn't make herself get up and walk away. "I have to get back to work," she signed. Her hands were shaking. "I need to think. Sal, I need to think." "I know," he signed. "Take all the time you need. I am not going anywhere. I have sat at this table alone for 2 years. I can wait." He hesitated. "But Tessa, whatever you decide, I am glad you came back. Even if it is the last time, I am glad." She stood. She made it to the door, and then she stopped her hand on the wood and turned back one last time. "The people out there," she signed. "The manager, Brett, he's been telling everyone I'm using you, that I set the whole thing up." She didn't know why she was telling him. Maybe because he'd been so honest, and she wanted to be honest too. Maybe because she was scared and she needed him to know. It's making my life very hard. I wanted you to know why I look scared. Something changed in Salvatore's face. It was subtle. She almost missed it. But she'd spent her whole life reading faces, and she watched the warmth drain out of his and something else move in behind it, something still and cold and very, very old. His hands came up slowly. "The manager," he signed. "Brett, he is spreading lies about you, because of me, because you were kind to me. It's not your fault." She signed quickly, and too late she understood she'd made a mistake. She'd handed something to a man who could do things with it. "Sal, please, it's fine. I can handle Brett. I don't want you to—" "What is his last name?" Salvatore signed. "Sal. Tessa." His hands were gentle, but the thing behind his eyes was not gentle at all. "I am not going to do anything you do not want. I am asking a question, nothing more. What is his last name?" She should have refused. She knew even in the moment that she should have refused. But she was so tired and so scared, and there was a part of her, a small, ugly, honest part, she wasn't proud of, that wanted someone bigger than Brett to finally make Brett stop. "Sullivan," she signed. "Brett Sullivan." Salvatore nodded once, his hands stilled, and he signed the last thing she'd take home with her that night, the thing that would keep her up until dawn. "Go back to work," he signed. "Do not worry about Brett Sullivan anymore." Tessa walked out of the private room with her heart hammering against her ribs, and she knew with a cold certainty that she'd just set something in motion that she could not take back. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. She served her tables. She smiled at customers. She ignored the sidelong looks from Chelsea and Marcus, and the whole time one sentence kept circling in her mind like a bird that wouldn't land. Do not worry about Brett Sullivan anymore. What did that mean? What had she done? She'd given a man who admitted to having a violent past the full name of the man who'd been tormenting her. What happened now? What happened to Brett? She told herself she was overreacting. She told herself Salvatore just meant he'd handle it, talk to someone, put in a word, get her a transfer to a better restaurant. She told herself a lot of things on that bus ride home, and she didn't believe a single one of them. The next day, Friday, Brett didn't come to work. Tessa didn't think much of it at first. Managers took days off. But by the middle of the shift, the whispers had started, and these whispers weren't about her. "You hear about Brett? What happened to Brett? Nobody knows. He just didn't show, not answering his phone." Tessa's stomach dropped through the floor. She found Owen by the dish pit, the same place she'd found him the week before, and this time it was her hands that were shaking. "Owen," she said. "Where's Brett?" Owen looked up, and his face was pale. "You don't know. Know what, Owen? Where is he?" Owen glanced around, then leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. "Two guys came to see him last night, after close, in the parking lot. I was taking out the trash. I saw the whole thing. Big guys, suits. They didn't yell, they didn't touch him. They just talked to him, real quiet, for like 10 minutes. And Brett, Tessa, I've never seen Brett scared of anything in my life, and he was shaking. When they left, he got in his car, and he peeled out of that lot like the devil was after him. He texted the owner this morning, said he's got a family emergency out of state, said he doesn't know when he's coming back." Owen swallowed hard. "But there's no family emergency, Tessa. I saw his face. Those guys said something to him. Whatever they said, it made him run." Tessa felt the room tilt around her. She grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself. She'd done this. She'd given Salvatore the name, and Salvatore had sent men, and now Brett Sullivan was gone, fled the state, scared out of his own life by two quiet men in suits who never even had to raise a hand. Do not worry about Brett Sullivan anymore. That's what he'd meant. That's exactly what he'd meant. And the thing that scared her most, the thing that turned her stomach and made her grip the counter so hard her knuckles went white, was not that it had happened. It was the small, shameful, undeniable flicker of relief she felt underneath the horror. Brett was gone. The man who'd tormented her, who'd lied about her, who'd threatened to bury her was just gone, and all it had taken was one name signed across a white tablecloth. That was the moment Tessa Walker understood all the way down to her bones what it meant to be close to a man like Salvatore Marino. It meant that the world rearranged itself around her wishes. It meant that consequences were silent and absolute and arrived before she'd even finished being afraid. "Owen," she said, and her voice didn't sound like her own. "Did anyone else see them? The men in the parking lot?" "No, just me. I don't think Brett even saw me." Owen's eyes searched her face. "Tessa, do you know something about this? Because the way you look right now—" "I don't know anything," she said too fast. Owen didn't believe her. She could see he didn't believe her, but he also didn't push. He just nodded slowly and went back to his dishes, and Tessa walked away on legs that barely held her. She made it to the walk-in cooler, pulled the heavy door shut behind her, and stood in the cold with her breath fogging in front of her, and finally let herself shake. Because she'd wanted this. That was the horror of it. When she'd signed Brett's name, some part of her had wanted exactly this, and Salvatore had given it to her the way you'd hand a gift to someone you cared about. No questions asked, because that was how his world worked, and because for the first time in a long time, he had someone he wanted to give things to. She thought about Daniel, about the small apartment, the twin bed, the notebook full of impossible math, about how hard she'd worked to build a life where nobody could touch them, where she controlled everything, where she owed nobody anything. And now she'd let a man with a violent past reach into that life, and she'd watched him make a person disappear, and she'd felt relieved. What did that make her? What was she becoming? And what happened the next time she had a problem, and the man across the table asked for a name? That was the moment the fear finally caught up to the warmth and passed it. Because she understood, standing in that cold room, that Salvatore hadn't done this to control her or to trap her. He'd done it because he cared about her in the only language his world had ever taught him. And that was so much worse. A cruel man she could have walked away from. But a man who was trying to be good, who was kind to her, who paid attention to whether she got her tips and remembered her brother's name and wanted only that she not be alone at a table, and who also, without blinking, could make her enemies flee the state in the middle of the night. How did she walk away from that? How did she stay? She didn't have an answer. She stood in the cold until her manager banged on the door asking if she was okay, and then she wiped her face and went back to the floor and finished her shift because the bills didn't care about her moral crisis and Daniel still needed to eat. That night, her phone buzzed on the bus. Vincent again. "Miss Walker, Mr. Marino wanted me to confirm that the situation at your workplace has been resolved. He wants you to know you are safe and that you should not concern yourself with the details. He asks nothing in return. He simply wanted you to be able to work in peace." Tessa read it 3 times. She thought about not answering. She thought about a lot of things. And then before she could stop herself, her thumbs were moving. "I need to talk to him, not through you, him, Thursday. Please tell him I'm coming, and I need to talk to him about what he did." The reply came a minute later. "He will be there. He said he expected you would want to talk. He said, and I quote, 'Tell her I understand. Tell her I will listen to whatever she needs to say.'" Tessa put the phone in her lap and stared out the dark bus window at the city sliding past. All those lit windows, all those lives, none of them knowing that a quiet waitress had just learned she was holding a kind of power she'd never asked for and didn't know how to put down. She got home to find Daniel waiting up again, and this time he took one look at her and didn't ask what happened. He just got up, crossed the kitchen, and hugged her the way he used to when he was small, and she was the one who needed holding for a change. And Tessa held her deaf little brother in the middle of their tiny kitchen and thought about the $1,800 she still didn't have, and the man who'd offered it, and the manager who'd fled the state, and she understood that she was standing at a fork in her life, and that whatever she chose on Thursday would decide what kind of person she was going to be. Because Salvatore Marino had shown her in the most terrible and gentle way possible exactly what he was willing to do for her. And now she had to decide what she was willing to accept, whether she could love a man like that, or even just care about him without losing the one thing she'd protected her whole life. The thing that made her different from Brett, different from all of them. The thing that let her look at herself in the mirror. Her dignity, Her line, the part of her that would rather carry $1,800 of impossible debt than owe a single favor she couldn't pay back clean. She pulled back from Daniel and looked at his face, his open, trusting 17-year-old face, and she made him a silent promise. Whatever she decided about Salvatore, she would not let his world touch this boy. She would not let the silence and the fear and the men in suits anywhere near the one clean thing she'd built. "You okay?" Daniel signed, watching her. "I will be," she signed back. "I've got something I have to figure out. Something hard." "You always figure it out." He signed with the absolute confidence of a kid who'd never once seen his sister fail him. "You're the strongest person I know." And that, more than anything Brett had done or Salvatore had offered, was what settled it. Because Daniel thought she was strong. And strong wasn't letting a powerful man solve your problems by making people disappear. Strong was walking into that private room on Thursday and telling Salvatore Marino, the most feared man in the city, that what he'd done was wrong and that she couldn't accept it, and that if he wanted her to keep coming back, things were going to have to be different. Strong was being willing to lose him to keep herself. She just prayed she had the courage to do it when the moment came. Because sitting here in her kitchen with Daniel's arms around her, it was easy to know the right thing. It would be a lot harder on Thursday across that white tablecloth, looking into the face of the one man in the world who'd ever bothered to learn to see her. Tessa lay awake most of that night rehearsing it in her hands in the dark. The words she'd sign, the lines she'd draw, over and over until the ceiling turned gray with dawn and she still hadn't gotten it right. And she understood that some conversations you couldn't rehearse, you could only walk into and pray. 3 more days until Thursday. 3 days to decide who Tessa Walker was going to be. 3 days turned out to be enough time for everything to get worse. It started Tuesday when the restaurant owner himself, a nervous man named Mr. Delgado, who almost never came down to the floor, pulled Tessa aside into his cramped office and shut the door. "Sit," he said. He didn't sit himself. He paced, wringing his hands. "Tessa, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Her stomach clenched. "Okay. Brett, you know he's gone. Family emergency, he says, but I've been getting calls." Delgado stopped pacing and looked at her. "Calls from people asking about our books, about our liquor license, about whether we've been compliant with our vendor contracts. Very polite people, very well informed. And this morning a man I have never met sent me a very generous offer to buy into the restaurant. Out of nowhere. And when I said no, he said, and I'm quoting him, that he'd hate to see a good business run into difficulty." Tessa's mouth went dry. "Now," Delgado went on, "I've been in this city a long time. I know what those calls sound like. I know what that offer means. And it all started the same week Brett ran off, and the same week people started telling me, you've got some kind of relationship with Salvatore Marino." He leaned on the desk. "So I need to know. What have you gotten my restaurant into?" "Nothing," Tessa said, and her voice cracked. "Mr. Delgado, I swear to you, I didn't ask for any of this. I served him. That's all. I served a deaf customer, and I signed to him because I know how, and everyone turned it into something it isn't." Delgado studied her for a long moment, and then to her surprise, his face softened just a little. "You know what?" he said quietly. "I believe you. I've watched you work for 3 years. You're the hardest working, most honest person I've got, and you never gave me a reason to doubt you." He sighed and rubbed his face. "But it doesn't matter if I believe you, Tessa, because whatever's happening, it's happening around you, and I've got 22 other employees and a mortgage on this place. I can't have this kind of attention. I hope you understand." The floor dropped out from under her. "Are you firing me?" No, I'm not firing you." He held up his hands. "I'm just asking you to be careful. And I'm asking you if you have any way to make this attention stop, to please use it. For all our sakes." He paused. "Whatever this man is to you, however he sees you, right now his interest in you is bleaking out onto everyone around you, and people are getting scared. You included from the look of you." He wasn't wrong. Tessa walked out of that office shaking. It had never occurred to her in all her worrying about herself and Daniel that Salvatore's interest in her could spread like a stain, could touch Delgado and the other servers and the whole restaurant. She'd thought of it as a private thing, a thing between her and one man across a table. But there was no such thing as a private thing with a man like Salvatore. Everything he touched sent ripples out into the world, and the ripples reached people who'd done nothing but stand nearby. She thought about Owen, about Delgado, about the 22 other employees, about Daniel. She was carrying a kind of danger now just by existing, just by being the woman Salvatore Marino had decided to care about, and she hadn't chosen any of it. That night, the fear got worse, because that night, Daniel came home from school with a story. "Weird thing happened today," he signed at the kitchen table, and Tessa's whole body went cold before he even finished. "A man talked to me, outside school. He knew sign. Real fluent too, better than most hearing people I've met." Tessa's hands froze over her own dinner. What man? What did he look like? Older. Nice suit. Real polite. Daniel shrugged, oblivious to the way his sister had gone rigid. He asked if I was Daniel Walker. I said yeah. He said he was a friend of yours. He said you were a very special person, and that I was lucky to have you. And then he said if I ever needed anything at all, I should tell you to call Vincent. Daniel grinned. It was kind of nice, actually. Not a lot of people bother to sign to me. Who is he? A new boyfriend. Tessa could not breathe. Vincent. They'd sent Vincent to her brother's school. They knew where Daniel went to school. They knew what he looked like, knew his name, had approached him on the sidewalk, and signed to him and been kind to him, and the message underneath the kindness was as clear and cold as ice water down her spine. We know about the boy. We can reach the boy. We are being gentle now. She didn't think Salvatore had meant it as a threat. That was the terrible part. She was almost certain, knowing him now, that he'd meant it as reassurance, as protection. See, we watch over the people you love too. In his world, having powerful men know your family and offer help was a gift, the highest gift a sign you were under someone's wing. He'd sent Vincent to Daniel the way a normal man might send flowers, but it didn't land as a gift. It landed as the single most frightening thing that had happened yet, because the one line Tessa had drawn, the one promise she'd made herself, was that Salvatore's world would never touch Daniel. And it already had. It had walked right up to him on a public sidewalk and signed hello. Tessa. Daniel's face had changed, catching her fear the way he always did. What's wrong? You look scared. Is he not a friend? Did I do something? No, she signed, forcing her hands to be calm, forcing her face into the flat mask she wore for everyone but him. No, baby, you didn't do anything wrong. He's a person I know from work. I didn't know he'd talk to you, that's all. It surprised me. But you're shaking. I'm cold. She wasn't cold. Daniel, listen to me. This is important. If that man or any man you don't know ever talks to you again, even if he's nice, even if he signs you walk away and you call me right away, you understand I don't care how polite they are. You call me. Daniel's brow furrowed. You're scaring me, Tess. I know, I'm sorry. She reached across and squeezed his hands. It's probably nothing. I just want you safe. That's my whole job, remember, keeping you safe. So humor me, okay? He nodded slowly, but the light had gone out of his face, and Tessa hated herself for it, hated that she'd brought fear home to the one place that was supposed to be safe from it. She'd spent her entire adult life building a wall around this boy, and she'd let a man tear a hole in it with nothing more than a kind word on a sidewalk. That was the night Tessa stopped hesitating. Whatever tangled, warm, complicated thing she felt for Salvatore Marino, whatever it had been growing into across those 2 Thursdays, it did not matter next to this. He had touched Daniel, and that meant the conversation she'd been rehearsing in the dark wasn't going to be a gentle drawing of lines anymore. It was going to be a reckoning. She barely slept. She went to work Wednesday like a woman walking to her own trial. And Wednesday was when the last piece fell into place, the piece that turned her fear into something harder and colder and more certain. Owen found her during the pre-shift setup, and he looked terrible, gray-faced and hollow-eyed, like a man who hadn't slept either. I have to tell you something, he said, and I have to tell you before you do anything else because it's been eating me alive. Owen, I don't have time for... I lied to you. He said it fast, like ripping off a bandage. Last week, when you asked me about the break room about Brett setting you up, I told you I didn't laugh and I didn't say anything. That was a lie. His voice was shaking. I helped him, Tessa. I was the one who told Brett you knew sign language. I heard you on the phone once, months ago, with your brother using video signing. I told Brett about it. That's why he picked you for the private room. He didn't just pick you because you were quiet. He picked you because I told him you could sign, and he thought it'd be funnier that way. The deaf man and the girl who signs, and he figured you'd be too scared to actually do it that you'd freeze up and run. Owen's eyes were wet. The whole thing, the whole joke. It happened because of me, because I wanted Brett to like me, because I was scared of him, and I thought if I gave him something funny, he'd leave me alone. Tessa stared at him. The room seemed to spin slowly around her. Everything she'd been through in the last 2 weeks, the whispers, the lies, Delgado's fear Vincent at Daniel's school, all of it traced back to this. To a scared 19-year-old busboy who'd overheard her signing to her brother and traded that small private thing to a bully to buy himself a little safety. "You told him," she said slowly. "You told Brett I could sign, so he'd send me to Salvatore." "Yes," Owen's voice broke. "And I've been sick about it ever since, because it wasn't supposed to be like this. It was supposed to be a stupid joke that fell flat. And instead, you actually signed to the guy, and it turned into this whole thing, and Brett's gone, and there's these men calling Delgado, and I keep thinking, this is all my fault, all of it. I started it, and I've been too much of a coward to tell you." Here was the twist that undid her. It wasn't a twist about Salvatore or Brett or the criminal world. It was smaller and more human than that, and somehow it hurt more. The thing that had connected her to Salvatore Marino, the one genuine and beautiful thing in this whole nightmare, the moment she'd signed to a lonely man, and he'd looked at her like she was a light in the dark. That moment only happened because a frightened boy had sold her secret to a bully as a joke. The best thing in her life right now had been born from the worst kind of betrayal. And she didn't even have the room to be angry because looking at Owen at his wet eyes and his shaking hands and his awful genuine guilt, she saw exactly herself. A person cornered by fear doing something small and shameful to survive and hating themselves for it. She'd almost taken Salvatore's money. She'd given Salvatore Brett's name. She'd felt relief when Brett vanished. She was not so clean that she got to stand over Owen in judgment. "Owen," she said quietly, "why are you telling me now?" "Because." He wiped his face with the back of his hand. "Because I've been watching what's happening to you. The whispers, the way everyone talks about you now. Chelsea and Marcus and the rest of them saying you're some kind of gold digger, some kind of schemer, and it's all a lie, and I know it's a lie because I know how it really started, and I've just been standing there letting them say it. Same as I stood there and let Brett set you up. I'm so tired of being the guy who just stands there." He took a shaky breath. "So I'm telling you, and if you want, I'll tell Delgado. I'll tell everyone. The whole truth about the break room, about the setup, about what Brett's really like, about how he's been running this floor like his own little kingdom, threatening people, playing games. I've got stories, Tessa, not just about you, about what he did to Renata, to Cole, to half the people who quit. I'll tell all of it. I needed to tell you first, because you're the one I hurt the most." And there it was. The thing Tessa hadn't known she needed. Because up until this moment, the only power in her life that could make things right was Salvatore's power, the power of men in suits and silent consequences, and people fleeing the state. The dark power, the kind that scared restaurant owners and approached deaf boys on sidewalks. She thought that was the only option, accept Salvatore's protection or face Brett's world alone. But here was Owen offering her a different kind of power, the clean kind, the slow, ordinary human kind, the truth told out loud by a witness willing to stand up. It wouldn't make anyone flee the state. It wouldn't happen in a parking lot at midnight. But it was hers, and it was clean, and it didn't cost her a single piece of her soul. She just had to be brave enough to choose it. And to choose it, she had to be willing to walk away from the easier, darker thing, from Salvatore's offer to erase her problems, from the $1,800, from all of it. "Owen," she said, "do you mean that because if you tell Delgado and then Brett somehow comes back, or Brett's friends come after you, it could cost you your job, your reference, you've got a kid on the way, this isn't nothing." "I know." His voice was steadier now. "I know exactly what it could cost, but I've been lying awake every night for 2 weeks feeling like garbage, and I'd rather lose the job than keep feeling like this. My kid's not even born yet, And I already don't want them growing up to be the kind of person I've been. The kind who just stands there. He met her eyes. So yeah, I mean it. Just tell me when. Tessa felt something break open in her chest, something warm and painful and enormous. Because this was it. This was the answer she'd been rehearsing in the dark and never getting right. She'd thought her only choices were to accept Salvatore's dark protection or to face the world alone. She'd never imagined a third door, a scared boy finding his courage, the truth spoken plainly. Justice that didn't require anyone to disappear. Soon, she said. Not yet. There's something I have to do first. Something I have to say to someone. But soon, Owen. And thank you. You have no idea what you just gave me. He looked confused, but he nodded, and something eased in his hollow face, the particular relief of a person who's finally set down a weight they've been carrying too long. That night, Tessa went home and sat with Daniel and helped him with his summer program application, the one she still had no idea how to pay for, and she found that she didn't care anymore about the money the way she had. Because sitting there watching her brother's hands fly with excitement as he wrote about why he wanted to learn from deaf instructors, she understood something that made the whole tangled knot come clear. She could not build Daniel's future on Salvatore's money. She could not build it on men in suits and silent favors and consequences that arrived in parking lots at midnight. Because if she did, then everything Daniel became would have that darkness underneath it, would be founded on the one thing she'd sworn to keep away from him. The whole point of every double shift, every bleeding foot, every dollar counted twice, had been to build him a clean life. A life that was theirs. A life nobody could take back or hold over their heads. If she let Salvatore pay, she'd be trading Daniel's clean future for an easier present, and she would not do it. She'd rather carry $1,800 of impossible debt on her own back forever than hand her brother a future with strings she couldn't see. That was the moment she knew exactly what she was going to say on Thursday. Not the gentle line drawing she'd rehearsed, not the careful negotiation. The whole truth signed clean across that white tablecloth to the most feared man in the city. She was going to tell Salvatore Marino no. No to the money. No to the protection. No to the men in suits. No to Vincent at Daniel's school. No to all of it, the whole dark, beautiful, terrible offer of a world where her problems disappeared and her enemies fled the state, and she never had to be afraid or tired or alone again. She was going to look into the face of the one man who'd ever truly seen her, and she was going to refuse the only thing he knew how to give. And she was terrified because she didn't know if their fragile, real 2 Thursdays old connection could survive it. She didn't know if a man who'd been lonely for 40 years, who'd finally found one person who spoke his language and told him the truth, could hear the word no without it becoming another betrayal, another person turning away, another proof that the world would always talk around him and never to him. She thought about that all night, about the risk, about how easy it would be to just take the help, to let herself be protected, to let Daniel go to his program, and let Brett stay gone, and let herself for once be taken care of. God, how she wanted to be taken care of. She'd been carrying everything alone for so long that the offer of someone strong enough to carry it for her was almost unbearable to refuse. But she thought about what it would cost, not in money, in herself, in the thing that let her look Daniel in the eye when he called her the strongest person he knew, in the line between her and Brett, between her and every person who'd ever used power to make someone else small. She thought about the flicker of relief she'd felt when Brett vanished and how frightened that relief had made her, because she'd seen in that flicker how easy it would be to like this power, to start reaching for it, to become someone who solved her problems by giving men names across a table. She was not going to become that person, whatever it cost her with Salvatore. Thursday morning came gray and cold. Tessa got Daniel off to school watching from the window until he was safely down the block, unable to stop scanning the sidewalk for men in nice suits who knew how to sign. Then she got ready for work with the slow, deliberate calm of a person preparing for something enormous. She thought she had it all planned. She thought she knew exactly how the day would go. She would work her shift. She would go to the private room. She would tell Salvatore the truth, all of it, and she would find out whether their connection could survive her refusing his world. And then whatever he said, she would come back and tell Owen it was time, and Owen would go to Delgado, and the clean, slow human truth would come out, and Brett's kingdom would fall the right way, the honest way, without anyone having to disappear. That was the plan. But when Tessa got to work that Thursday, everything she'd planned came apart in the first 5 minutes, because the section assignments weren't posted in Brett's handwriting anymore. Brett was gone. And the new schedule printed fresh that morning didn't have her name on the private room at all. It had Chelsea's. Tessa stared at the sheet, her heart pounding. Chelsea, in the private room with Salvatore. Chelsea, who'd called her a gold digger, who'd filmed her, who thought Salvatore was a monster, and Tessa a schemer working an angle. Chelsea, who had no idea the man in that room was deaf, who would walk in there and talk at him and grow flustered and cruel, who might do or say something that could not be taken back. And under her fear for what Chelsea might stumble into, a colder fear. Because Tessa had spent 2 weeks learning exactly how Salvatore's world responded to people who disrespected the ones he cared about. She'd seen what happened to Brett. And she thought with a stab of pure dread, what happens if Chelsea walks into that room and is cruel to him? What happens then? Who does Salvatore send? Where does Chelsea run? She had to get to that room. She had to get there before Chelsea did. She grabbed the schedule, her hands shaking, and went to find whoever had taken over Brett's duties, some assistant manager named Pam, who barely knew the floor, and she heard her own voice come out high and desperate. Pam, the private room. Table 9, that's supposed to be mine. There's been a mistake. Pam looked up, harried, holding a clipboard. No, honey, Chelsea requested it special this morning. Said she had a rapport with the regular back there. Said you'd been having some kind of trouble with him, and she wanted to smooth it over. Pam frowned. That's not right, because she was real insistent. Tessa's blood ran cold. Chelsea hadn't requested that room to smooth anything over. Chelsea had requested it to see for herself, to catch Tessa in her supposed scheme, or to get her own piece of the dangerous, powerful, fascinating man everyone was whispering about. Chelsea was walking into that room to play the exact same game Brett had, and she had no idea at all what she was actually walking into. And it was already too late. Because as Tessa turned toward the back of the restaurant, she saw the heavy oak door of the private room swing shut. Chelsea was already inside, already at the table, already right now standing in front of Salvatore Marino with her order pad and her cruel little smile and her complete catastrophic ignorance of the fact that the man could not hear a single word she was about to say. Tessa started running. Tessa hit the oak door with her shoulder and shoved it open, and the sight that met her stopped her cold in the doorway. Chelsea was standing beside the table with her order pad in one hand and her phone in the other, held low against her apron, but pointed up recording. And she was talking fast and loud and cruel, the way people talk when they think the person in front of them can't understand and can't answer back. It's so weird, honestly. You just sit there and don't say anything. No wonder they think you're a psycho. No wonder people are scared of you. Chelsea's voice was bright and vicious, performing for the camera she thought she was hiding. The little mute girl came out of here acting like you two were in love. Can you believe that? Like you'd ever look twice at trash like her. I bet you can't even understand a word I'm saying, can you? You just sit there like a big scary lump. Chelsea! Tessa's voice cut across the room like a blade. Chelsea spun around and her face went through 3 expressions in a single second: surprise, then guilt, then a hard, defiant sneer as she shoved the phone deeper into her apron. This isn't your table, Tessa. Get out. I requested it. Get away from him. Tessa was already crossing the room. Right now, Chelsea, I'm not kidding. Put the phone away and step back from that table. Or what? Chelsea planted her feet. You gonna have your boyfriend's goons come after me like they did Brett? Yeah, that's right. I know all about it. Everybody knows. Brett didn't have a family emergency. Brett got run out of town because your creepy old mobster snapped his fingers. That's who you're mixed up with, Tessa. That's what you are now. His little... Tessa didn't hear the rest because she was watching Salvatore. He was sitting perfectly still, the way he always did, his big, scarred hands flat on the tablecloth. But his eyes were moving, reading. That was the thing about Salvatore that Chelsea would never understand, could never understand, because she thought silence meant emptiness. He couldn't hear a single word Chelsea was saying. But he'd spent 40 years reading the room, reading faces, reading the shape of cruelty in a person's mouth and shoulders and eyes, And he was reading Chelsea now, reading every ugly thing she'd been saying, understanding all of it without a single sound reaching his ears. And then his eyes moved to Tessa, and Tessa watched him take in her face, her fear the way she'd burst through that door, and she watched him understand that too. Understand that she'd come running, understand what she'd been running from and what she'd been running toward. His hands came up off the table. "Tessa," he signed slow and calm, ignoring Chelsea completely. "This woman, is she one of the ones who spreads the lies about you?" Tessa's heart was pounding so hard she could barely make her hands work, but she answered him because she would not lie to him, not even now. "Yes," she signed, "one of them." Chelsea's head whipped back and forth between them, and her sneer faltered as she watched the two of them talk in a language she didn't understand right in front of her about her. What are you doing? Stop that. Stop doing that with your hands. That's so—" She laughed, but it came out shaky. "Oh my God, you actually think he understands that, Tessa? He's messing with you. Nobody actually— He's deaf, Chelsea." Tessa turned on her, and something in her voice made Chelsea take a step back. "He's deaf. That's what none of you ever bothered to find out. You've all spent 2 years being scared of a man in a private room, and not one of you ever wondered why he never spoke. He can't hear you. He never could. Everything you just said, everything you were filming to laugh at later. You said it to a man who's been sitting alone in this room for 2 years, because people like you would rather be afraid of him than say hello." Her voice cracked. "And he read every word off your face, so congratulations. He knows exactly what you are." The color drained out of Chelsea's face. Her eyes went to Salvatore, really seeing him for the first time, and Tessa watched the horror dawn on her, the slow, terrible understanding of what she'd just done and who she'd just done it to. "I didn't," Chelsea started. "I didn't know." Salvatore's hands moved again. Tessa read them and her breath caught. "Ask her," he signed, "if she is afraid of me now." And Tessa understood in that moment exactly what kind of test she was standing in the middle of. Because this was it, this was the fork. Salvatore was watching her waiting, and the whole thing hung in the balance. She could use him, right here, right now. She could turn to Chelsea and let the fear do its work, let Chelsea stand there trembling, let her feel a fraction of what Tessa had felt these last 2 weeks. She could let Salvatore be the weapon everyone already believed he was. It would be so easy. It would even be in a small, ugly way, just. Chelsea was staring at her, waiting for it too. Waiting for Tessa to unleash the monster. Everyone in this story had been waiting for that from the very beginning, from the moment Brett first said, "Watch the freak entertain the freak." They'd all been waiting to see the mute girl reveal herself as the schemer, the girl who'd found a dangerous man, and would use him to destroy everyone who'd wronged her. And Tessa looked at Chelsea's white, frightened face, and she made her choice. "No," she said, out loud to Chelsea. And then she raised her hands and signed it to Salvatore so he'd know exactly what she was saying to both of them at once. "No, I'm not going to ask her that. I'm not going to threaten her. I'm not going to use you to scare her." Her hands were shaking, but they didn't stop. "Sal, listen to me. I have to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it. Read it, whatever. I need you to understand it." Salvatore went very still. He nodded slowly, his eyes locked on her hands. "What you did to Brett," she signed. "I know it was for me. I know you did it because he was hurting me, and you wanted it to stop. And a part of me was relieved. I have to be honest with you because you've always been honest with me. When he disappeared, part of me was glad." Her throat was tight, her eyes stinging. "But Sal, it scared me more than anything has ever scared me. Not because of what it did to Brett, because of what it did to me. Because I felt that relief, and I understood how easy it would be to want it again, to start reaching for it, to become someone who solves her problems by giving people's names to men in suits." She took a breath. "And I can't be that person. I won't be. I have a little brother who thinks I'm the strongest person in the world, and I will not become someone who has to hide from him what she is." Chelsea had gone completely silent, watching hands she couldn't read, carry a conversation she couldn't follow, sensing only that something enormous was happening in the room. "You sent Vincent to Daniel's school," Tessa signed, and now the tears did come spilling over, but her hands stayed clear and steady. "I know you meant it as kindness. I know in your world that's the highest thing, letting someone know their family is watched over, protected. But Sal, I have spent my whole life building a wall around that boy to keep your world out. Not because I think you'd hurt him. I know you wouldn't. But because the second your world touches his life stops being clean, stops being ours, starts having strings underneath it that neither of us can see. And I can't let that happen. Even for you. Even though... Her hands faltered. Even though you're the only person in years who ever looked at me like I was real. The room was silent. Chelsea had backed all the way to the wall, and Salvatore Marino sat across the table with his hands frozen in the air and something happening in his face that Tessa had never seen there before. "You are refusing me," he signed slowly. "Yes. The money for your brother. The protection. All of it." "Yes." Tessa's tears were running freely now, but her hands did not waver. "All of it. Sal, I would rather work double shifts until I'm 60. I would rather owe that $1,800 for the rest of my life. I would rather be scared and tired and alone than take one thing from you that turns me into someone I can't respect." She paused, and this was the hardest part, the part she'd rehearsed in the dark and never gotten right, and it turned out you couldn't rehearse it. You could only mean it. "And I'm scared that when I refuse you, you'll think it's the same as everyone else turning away from you, that it's me talking around you like they all do. But it isn't. It's the opposite. I'm talking to you, the realest way I know how. I'm telling you the truth, even though it might cost me you, because you deserve the truth more than you deserve to be handled. That's what you are to me, someone I tell the truth to, not someone I use." For a long, long moment, Salvatore did not move at all, and Tessa stood there with her heart in pieces, certain she'd lost him, certain that a man who'd been lonely for 40 years had just heard the one person who spoke his language tell him no, and would file it away with every other rejection, would close back up like a fist would go back to sitting alone at this table every Thursday for the rest of his life. She'd done the right thing, and it was going to cost her the only real connection she'd had in years, and she'd known that going in, and she'd done it anyway, and now she had to live with it. Then Salvatore's hands came up, and they were not steady. This man whose hands were always so still, so controlled, was signing with hands that trembled. "Do you know," he signed, "how long I have waited for someone to tell me no?" Tessa's breath stopped. "Everyone says yes to me." His hands moved slowly, heavily, like each word cost him something. "Everyone. For 40 years. Yes, Mr. Marino. Whatever you want, Mr. Marino. They say yes because they are afraid, or because they want something, or because they think I cannot tell the difference. I have been drowning in yes my whole life, Tessa. Yes is how you talk around a man. Yes is how you handle him. Yes is what you say to a thing you are frightened of, so it will not turn on you." He stopped, and his jaw worked, and when his hands moved again, they were even slower. And then a waitress signs to me across a table, and the first real thing she ever does is refuse me. Refuse my money. Refuse my protection. Tell me the truth, even though she thinks it will make me leave. His eyes were wet now, too. This enormous, frightening man. This man the whole city feared. That is not someone talking around me. That is the first person in 40 years who talked to me like I was a man who could be told no, like I was a man and not a weapon. Do you understand what you have given me? You think you have taken something from me. You have given me the only thing I ever wanted. Tessa put her hand over her mouth. She couldn't sign. She couldn't do anything. She just stood there and cried while the most feared man in Chicago told her with shaking hands that her refusal was a gift. "I sent Vincent to your brother because it is the only way I know to show care," Salvatore signed. "You are right. In my world, it is the highest thing. But you are also right that it does not belong in his world, and I did not think of that because I have never had a clean world to protect. I have never had anything clean at all." His hands slowed. "You have. You have built one with your own 2 hands out of nothing for that boy. And I walked into it without thinking, and I put my fingerprints on it. I am sorry. I did not understand what I was touching. Now I do. Sal, I will call Vincent," he signed. "No one will ever approach Daniel again. No one will watch him. Your wall stays. I will not put another fingerprint on anything you have built. You have my word, and my word is the one thing in my life that has never been for sale." He paused. "And the money. Keep your no. I will not offer again. Not because I do not want to help, because you have shown me that some help is really only control wearing a kinder face. And I have spent my whole life confusing the two. You just taught me the difference. That is worth more than $1,800. That is worth more than anything I have." And that was the moment, standing in that private room with Chelsea pressed silent against the wall and tears running down both their faces, that Tessa understood the real twist of the whole thing. She'd walked in believing she had to choose between accepting Salvatore's dark power or losing him. She'd been so sure that refusing his world meant refusing him, that the no would break them. And instead the no was the thing that made them real. Because everyone in his life had said yes, and the yes had kept him a monster, kept him a weapon, kept him alone. And her no, her clean, hard, frightened no, was the first thing anyone had ever done that treated him like a person capable of choosing to be good. She hadn't lost him by refusing his power. She'd finally reached him. "There is one more thing," Salvatore signed, and his eyes moved past her to Chelsea, still frozen against the wall. His face changed, not to cruelty, to something quieter and more deliberate. "This woman, and the man who ran, and all the others who made your life small. In my world, I would make them disappear, and you would never have to think of them again. That is what I know how to do." His hands paused. "But you have just told me that is not what you want. So I'm asking you, Tessa, because it is your life and not mine. What do you want done? Whatever you say, I will do it, or not do it. Your choice, not mine, for the first time someone else's choice." And there it was, the final test handed to her not as a trap, but as a gift. Salvatore was giving her his power and telling her to decide how it was used, or whether it was used at all. He was putting the weapon down in front of her and stepping back, and she understood that this too was something he'd never done in his life. He'd never once let someone else hold the choice. Tessa turned and looked at Chelsea. Chelsea, who'd filmed her, mocked her, called her trash, called her a schemer, stood in this very room minutes ago and said the cruelest things she could think of to a man she believed couldn't understand. Chelsea, who was now white-faced and shaking and looked like she might be sick, having finally understood that the monster in the private room was a deaf man who'd read her cruelty off her own mouth, and that the mute girl she'd tormented held her fate in her hands. Tessa could destroy her, right now, with a nod. She could nod, and Chelsea would join Brett in whatever silent oblivion Salvatore's world sent people to. And God help her, part of her wanted to. The part that had cried in the walk-in cooler. The part that had lain awake for 2 weeks. The part that was so tired of being small. But she thought about Daniel. About being the strongest person he knew. About the clean world she was fighting to build. And she thought about what Salvatore had just told her. That everyone said yes. That the yes was what kept him a monster. If she nodded now, she wouldn't just be destroying Chelsea. She'd be saying yes to the very thing she'd just refused. She'd be teaching Salvatore that her no had a price, that it only applied when it was convenient. That underneath it all, she was just like everyone else who'd ever used him. She'd be undoing the one true thing she'd just given him. "Nothing," Tessa said, and signed. "I want nothing done to her." Chelsea made a small sound, a gasp of disbelief. "Sal, I don't want her disappeared. I don't want her scared into leaving town. I don't want your world anywhere near her, because the second it touches her, it's touching me too. It's making me into the person she already thinks I am." Tessa's hands were steady, now steadier than they'd been all day. "What I want is for the truth to come out, the real truth. Not through fear, through people telling it out loud in the light, the honest way. And that's already happening, Sal. There's a boy at the restaurant, Owen, and he's ready to tell everyone what really went on here. What Brett did, how it started, all of it, clean, in the light. That's the justice I want. The kind I don't have to hide from my brother. The kind that doesn't cost me my soul." She looked at Chelsea. "And she can either be part of the truth coming out, or she can be part of what gets swept away by it. That's up to her. But I'm not going to decide her life for her. I'm not going to become the thing everyone in this restaurant already believes I am. I'd rather earn my clean ending even if it takes longer. even if it's harder.
Gikmai sa tatachi.
Salvatore looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something Tessa had never seen him do. He smiled. Not the distant cousin of a smile from that first night. A real one, full and warm and astonished, the smile of a man who'd just watched someone do the exact thing he'd spent his whole life believing was impossible. "You are," he signed, "the strongest person I have ever met." And Tessa laughed through her tears, because that was exactly what Daniel always said, and hearing it from this man, this frightening, gentle, lonely, changing man, meant that maybe, just maybe, she really was. Salvatore turned his attention to Chelsea. He couldn't speak to her, of course, so he looked at Tessa. "Tell her something for me," he signed. "Okay. Tell her that she is safe, that nothing will happen to her, that the woman she spent 2 weeks calling trash just chose to protect her when I offered to do the opposite." His hands paused. "And tell her that she should think for the rest of her life about what kind of person does that. Because I have known killers with more mercy in them than she showed in this room today, and the only reason she walks out of here untouched is the person she treated the worst. Tell her to remember that." Tessa turned to Chelsea and translated all of it, watching Chelsea's face crumble as she understood that the deaf mobster she'd feared had wanted to destroy her, and the mute waitress she'd tormented had saved her, and the entire architecture of who she'd decided was the monster and who was the victim had just been turned completely upside down. "Tessa," Chelsea whispered, I'm sorry. I didn't know about any of it. I'm so sorry." "I know you didn't know," Tessa said quietly. "That's the whole problem, Chelsea. None of you ever bothered to know anything. You decided who I was and who he was without ever once asking, and it almost cost you everything. So do what he said. Remember it." She paused. "Now put your phone on the table." Chelsea flinched. "What?" "The phone, the video you were filming. Put it on the table and delete it right now in front of me, and then you can go." Chelsea fumbled the phone out of her apron with shaking hands, opened it, and deleted the video, holding the screen up so Tessa could see it was gone. Then she set the phone down, and she looked at Tessa one more time, and whatever she saw there made her drop her eyes. "Go," Tessa said. "Tell Pam I'm taking this table. Tell her whatever you want. Just go." Chelsea went. The oak door swung shut behind her, and then it was just the two of them again. Tessa and Salvatore alone in the private room, where all of it had started as a cruel joke 2 Thursdays ago. Tessa sat down in the chair across from him, the same chair, and for a moment, neither of them signed anything at all. They just looked at each other, two people the world had spent their whole lives talking around, sitting in the quiet, having finally completely talked to each other. "You could have used me," Salvatore signed at last. "Twice now. Against Brett, you gave me his name, and you were right to be frightened of how easy that was. But just now, against that woman, you had every reason and every right, and you refused. Why? Tell me the real reason. Not the reason about your brother. The reason underneath that one." Tessa thought about it. Really thought about it the way he deserved. And then she signed the truest thing she had. "Because I know what it's like to have someone decide who you are and use you for it," she signed. "Brett decided I was a punchline and used me for a joke. Chelsea decided I was a schemer and used me for a story. My whole life people have looked at my quiet and decided it meant they could do whatever they wanted with me." She paused. "And you, Sal. People decided you were a weapon, a monster, and they use you for it or they run from you for it. But either way, they've decided you're a thing and not a person. And I will not do to anyone what has been done to me. I will not use you as a weapon because that's just deciding you're a weapon, same as everyone else. The only way I know how to tell you that you're a person, really tell you, is to refuse to use you like a thing. Even when it's hard, even when I want to, especially then." Salvatore Marino sat very still, and then he lowered his face into his scarred hands. This enormous, feared man, and his shoulders shook, and Tessa realized he was weeping. She'd never seen anything like it. She sat with him in the quiet and let him, because she understood that some things a person had to feel all the way through, and that a man who'd been called a weapon for 40 years had just been called a person by the one voice he could hear. And that was a thing worth weeping over. When he lifted his head, his eyes were red, and his hands, when they moved, were gentle. "I have been trying to leave that world for 3 years," he signed. "I told you that. And I have failed over and over because I did not have a reason that was strong enough. You do not leave what I was born into for nothing. You need something on the other side worth more than the safety you are giving up." He looked at her. "I think I have been waiting my whole life to meet a reason. And I think today in this room, watching you refuse to become what I am, I finally met it. Not because I want anything from you, because you showed me without meaning to that a person can choose to be good, even when being bad is easier and safer and would feel like justice. If you can do that tired and poor and alone, then so can I. I have no more excuses left." His hands paused. "You did not just refuse my help, Tessa. You showed me how to refuse my own. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." Tessa reached across the white tablecloth slowly and put her hand over his scarred one. It was the first time they'd ever touched. His hand was huge and rough and warm, and it turned over under hers and held on careful, like a man holding something he was afraid of dropping. "Then let's both do it," she signed with her free hand. "The hard way, the clean way. You leave your world, really leave it all the way. And I'll build mine my way with my own 2 hands, no shortcuts, no strings. And every Thursday we meet right here in this room where they tried to make us into a joke, and we tell each other the truth about how it's going. Not victim and monster, not schemer and weapon. Just 2 people who talk to each other." Her hands paused. "Deal." Salvatore looked at their joined hands on the tablecloth, and then he freed his hand gently and lifted both of them and signed one word. "Deal." And somewhere out on the floor, Owen was already walking toward Mr. Delgado's office, his shoulders squared, his jaw set, ready to tell the whole truth in the light, the clean way, the way that wouldn't cost anyone their soul. The kingdom Brett had built on fear was about to come down, but it wasn't going to come down in a parking lot at midnight at the hands of men in suits. It was going to come down the right way, because a scared boy found his courage, because a quiet woman refused to become a weapon, and because the most feared man in the city had just been taught by a waitress who signed to him across a table the difference between the help that lifts a person up and the help that only ever holds them down. Owen didn't knock. He pushed open the door to Mr. Delgado's office, and by the time Tessa found her way back out onto the floor 20 minutes later, the whole thing had already started to unravel. She could feel it the moment she stepped out of the private room. Something in the air had shifted. Servers were clustered near the kitchen in 2s and 3s, whispering. But the whispers weren't about her anymore. They were about Brett. And Delgado's office door was shut, and through the little window she could see Owen sitting across from the owner talking, his hands moving with an urgency she'd never seen in the timid boy at the dish pit. Chelsea was standing near the coffee station, and when she saw Tessa, she didn't sneer. She looked away fast, her face pale, and Tessa understood that whatever had happened in that private room had cracked something open in Chelsea that wasn't going to close again. "What's going on?" Marcus asked, drifting up beside Tessa, his usual smirk gone. "Owen's been in there 20 minutes. Pam looks like she's about to cry. Somebody said the owner's calling corporate." "The truth's coming out," Tessa said quietly. "That's what's going on." She didn't explain more than that. She didn't have to. Because over the next hour, the story came out on its own, spreading from the office to the floor to the kitchen, and it was a very different story than the one Brett had been telling. Owen laid all of it out for Delgado, every piece. The break room setup, the bet on who'd film Tessa first, the plan to humiliate her with the deaf regular. And then once he'd started, he couldn't stop, and the rest came pouring out too. What Brett had done to Renata, the server who'd quit crying 2 summers ago. What he'd done to Cole, whom he'd worked into so many bad sections the kid had lost his apartment. The way Brett had run the whole floor like a private kingdom, threatening people's schedules, playing servers against each other, taking a cut of tips he had no right to. And it turned out Owen wasn't the only one who'd been waiting for someone to go first. The moment word got around that Owen had told the truth, others found their courage too. A line cook named Rosa knocked on Delgado's door and told him about the times Brett had skimmed the tip pool. A dishwasher named Tommy backed up the story about Cole. Even a couple of servers who'd laughed at Brett's jokes for years, who'd stood in that half circle waiting for Tessa to break, came forward now, because it turned out they'd been afraid of Brett too, and Brett being gone meant the fear could finally come off. That was the twist Tessa hadn't seen coming. She'd thought she was the only one Brett had cornered, but cruelty like his was never aimed at just one person. He'd built his little kingdom by making everyone a little bit afraid, a little bit complicit, a little bit ashamed. And the second one person stood up and said the truth out loud, the whole thing came apart, because it turned out almost everybody had been waiting their whole time at Belvedere for permission to stop being afraid. By the end of that shift, Delgado had made his decision. Brett Sullivan was not welcome back at Belvedere Family Emergency, or not. And the toxic system Brett had built, the games and the threats and the fear, was going to be dismantled top to bottom. Delgado called Tessa into his office at the end of the night. He looked older than he had 2 days ago, but there was something settled in his face now, something that had made a hard peace. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't—" "I do." He held up a hand. 2 days ago, I stood in this office, and I as good as told you that you were a problem, that the trouble was following you. And it turns out the trouble was already here. It was here for years, and I was too busy or too tired or too much of a coward to see it. You didn't bring the trouble, Tessa. You're the reason it finally came into the light. He paused. Owen told me everything, including the part he played, and including the part where you could have handled all this a very different way with your friend in the private room and you chose not to. I don't know all the details of that, and I don't think I want to, but I know enough to know you did something hard and right when doing something easy and wrong was sitting right there. He cleared his throat gruff. There's a floor manager position opening up, obviously. It's yours if you want it. And even if you don't, you've got a job here as long as I own this place, I mean that. Tessa sat there for a moment stunned. A floor manager position, steady salary. No more praying for good sections. No more counting on tips that might or might not come. It would change everything. It would mean Daniel's summer program was suddenly impossibly within reach, earned clean, earned with her own 2 hands and her own hard record. No strings underneath it, nothing to hide from anyone. I'll take it, she said. Thank you, I'll take it. She walked out of that office and had to stop in the hallway and press her hand against the wall because the relief was so enormous it made her dizzy. Not the relief of being rescued, the relief of being recognized. 3 years of never being late, never calling in sick, never letting a plate go cold. 3 years of being talked around and mocked and used for other people's entertainment, and it had finally amounted to something. Not because a powerful man snapped his fingers, because she'd kept her head down and done the work, and when the moment came, stood up straight and told the truth. That night, she went home and told Daniel everything she could tell him. She left out the parts about the criminal world and the men in suits the way she'd promised herself she always would. But she told him about the promotion, and she told him that his summer program was happening, that she'd found a way, an honest way, that was hers and his and nobody else's. Daniel's face when she signed it. She would remember that face for the rest of her life. He didn't celebrate right away. He just stared at her, and then his eyes filled up and he signed, "You did that. For me, you always do everything for me." "That's my job," she signed back, smiling. "It's the best job I've ever had." "No," Daniel signed, and he was crying now, this boy who'd learned to shrink his own dreams before she could disappoint him. "It's not your job, Tess. It's not supposed to be your job. You were supposed to have your own life, your own dreams, and you gave all of it to me." He wiped his face. "I'm going to that program, and I'm going to be so good, and someday I'm going to take care of you the way you took care of me. I promise you that." And Tessa pulled her brother into her arms and held him, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself believe it. Not that she needed taking care of, but that maybe someday she wouldn't have to carry everything alone, that the wall she'd built around this boy had held, that the clean world she'd fought for was still clean, and now it was a little bigger, and there was room in it finally for something like hope. The next Thursday, she went to the private room. Salvatore was there the way he'd promised he'd be, but something was different about him, and it took Tessa a moment to place it. He looked lighter. Not happy exactly, this wasn't a man who did happy easily, but the enormous stillness he carried had shifted, like a man who'd set down a weight he'd been holding so long, he'd forgotten it was heavy. "You look different," she signed, sitting down across from him. "I have been busy," he signed, and then because he'd promised her the truth and always kept his promises, he told her. "I met with certain people this week, people I have known my whole life, people I was born owing things to." His hands paused. "I told them I am out, all the way out. Not stepping back, not slowing down. Out." Tessa's breath caught. "Sal, can you even do that? Is that safe?" "It is never safe," he signed with something almost like humor. "You do not resign from what I was born into and expect a party. There were hard conversations. There will be more. It is not finished, and it will not be finished quickly, and I will not pretend to you that there is no danger in it, because I promised I would never soften the truth for you." He looked at her steadily. "But I am doing it. I have moved my legitimate holdings out of reach of the rest. I have made arrangements. I have spent 3 years failing to leave that world because I had no reason strong enough to justify the cost, and now I have one." He paused. "Not you. Do not think I mean it that way. I will not put that on you, the weight of being someone's reason. You are not responsible for saving me. That was never your job, and I would never ask it." "Then what?" Tessa signed. "What's the reason?" "You showed me I could choose," he signed simply. "That is all. For 40 years I believed I was what I was born to be. A weapon. A monster. A thing men are afraid of. I believed it so completely that I stopped even trying to be anything else. And then a waitress refused to use me as a weapon, and in refusing, she showed me that I did not have to be one. That a person can choose to be good even when being bad is easier. You did not save me, Tessa. You showed me I could save myself. And then it was my choice to actually do it. Mine. The first real choice I have made in 40 years. His hand slowed. So no. You are not my reason. You are the person who showed me I was allowed to have one." Tessa sat with that for a long moment, and she understood that this right here was the thing she'd been most afraid of getting wrong. She'd been terrified all through those sleepless nights that caring about Salvatore meant she'd have to save him, fix him, take responsibility for the darkness in his life. And he'd just told her plainly that he'd never ask her to, that his change was his own, that he wasn't handing her the job of redeeming him. He was simply telling her he'd decided to redeem himself and that she'd shown him it was possible. That was the difference between what they had and what she'd feared. She wasn't his rescuer, and he wasn't hers. They were just two people who'd each shown the other something they couldn't see alone. "I have a promotion," she signed, and she found she was smiling. "Floor manager, steady salary, and Daniel's going to his summer program. I paid for it myself." "Well, I will, once the new salary starts." Her hands paused. "Clean Sal. Every dollar of it clean. Earned. Nobody can ever take it back or hold it over us. I did it the hard way, and it took longer, and it was worth every day." Salvatore's face broke into that real smile again, the astonished one. "Of course you did," he signed. "I never doubted it. You are the strongest person I have ever met. Remember, I have known men who ran empires with less spine than you have, and they had armies. You had a job and a brother and 2 hands, and you built something clean out of a world that gives clean things to no one." He shook his head slowly. "I spent my whole life with power, and I was never once as free as you are. Do you understand that I could make men disappear, and I could not make myself into a person I could look at in a mirror? You have nothing, and you can. That is the only kind of strength that was ever worth anything. And you have all of it." And that was the moment Tessa understood fully and finally what these Thursdays had really been about. Not a poor waitress being lifted up by a powerful man, not a fairy tale, not a rescue. It had been the other way around the whole time. She'd been the one with the real power all along, the power to stay clean in a dirty world, to choose dignity over revenge, to tell the truth, even when a lie was safer. She just hadn't known it was power, because the world had never once treated it like power. and it had taken the most powerful man in the city, a man who could make people vanish with a word, to look at her across a white tablecloth and tell her that the thing she'd been doing all along, quietly, thanklessly, every single day, was the strongest thing he'd ever seen. They didn't become a fairy tale couple. That's not what this was, and it never became that, and Tessa was glad. What they built was slower and realer than that. They kept meeting every Thursday in that same private room where it had all started as a cruel joke, and they told each other the truth about how it was going. Some Thursdays the news was good. Some Thursdays Salvatore came in looking gray and worn, because leaving his old world was every bit as dangerous and slow and ugly as he'd warned her it would be, and there were weeks it nearly pulled him back under. But he never went back under, because every Thursday there was someone waiting in that room who talked to him instead of around him, who told him the truth, who reminded him with her whole clean, stubborn life that a person could choose. And Tessa built her world the way she'd always meant to. She was good at being floor manager, better than Brett had ever been, because she ran the floor the opposite of how he had, with respect instead of fear. Owen stayed on, and she made sure he knew that his courage was the thing that had brought the whole rotten kingdom down, that the scared boy at the dish pit had turned out to be braver than any of them. His kid was born that fall, a girl, and Owen brought her by the restaurant, and Tessa held the baby and thought about how a single act of honesty from one frightened person had rippled out and changed all their lives. Daniel went to his summer program. He came home the first day so full of joy he could barely sign fast enough, telling her about the deaf instructors and the other deaf kids and the whole community of people who moved through the world in his language, who understood without translation, who'd never once made him feel like he was less. He'd spent his whole life fitting himself into rooms that weren't built for him, and Tessa had given him one that was. He thrived there, and every skill he learned, every friend he made, every ounce of confidence he built was clean, was his, was founded on nothing but his sister's honest work and his own bright heart. No strings underneath it, no fingerprints from a darker world. Exactly the way she'd sworn it would be, back when it seemed impossible. Chelsea left Belvedere a few weeks after that Thursday in the private room. She didn't say much about why, but before she went, she found Tessa on the floor one afternoon, and she stood there for a long, awkward moment, and then she said, "I keep thinking about what he said, your friend, through you, about what kind of person does what you did." She swallowed. "I decided who you were without ever asking. I did that. And you saved me anyway. I don't understand it. I don't think I'll ever understand it. But I'm not going to be that person anymore, the one who decides. I just wanted you to know that you changed that. You didn't have to, and you did." And then she left, and Tessa never saw her again. But she thought about it sometimes, the strange truth that the mercy you show the people who wrong you can change them more than any revenge ever could. The seasons turned. Salvatore got further and further from his old world, and the danger of leaving it slowly gave way to the quieter difficulty of building something new. He started putting his legitimate money into legitimate things. He funded a program, quietly, no name attached, that put ASL interpreters into schools that couldn't afford them, so that no deaf child would have to sit in a classroom the way he'd sat in his, talked around and over and about, alone in the silence. He never told Tessa he'd done it. She found out by accident months later when Daniel came home talking about a new interpreter at a friend's school funded by some anonymous foundation, and Tessa put the pieces together and understood and cried and never said a word about it to Salvatore, because she knew that a gift given in silence was the purest kind, and that he'd finally learned the difference between the help that lifts a person up and the help that only holds them down. And every Thursday, they sat in that room. Two people the world had spent their whole lives talking around, who had finally completely talked to each other. Not victim and predator the way the whole restaurant had once seen it. Not schemer and weapon the way the lie had painted it. Not even rescuer and rescued the way a lesser story would have ended it. Just two equals connected by understanding, sitting across a white tablecloth, telling each other the truth with their hands. One Thursday, near the end of a long, good year, Salvatore signed something that Tessa carried with her for the rest of her life. "When I first saw you sign to me," He told her, "I thought you were the answer to being alone. I thought God had finally sent me someone to fill the silence." His hands paused. "I was wrong. You did not fill the silence, Tessa. You taught me the silence was never the problem. Being alone was never the problem. The problem was that I had let the world convince me I was a thing, and things cannot choose, and things cannot be good, and things are always, always alone. You did not fill anything. You reminded me I was a person, and a person is never really alone, because a person can always choose to reach out a hand." He reached across the table and put his huge scarred hand over her small one, the way they'd done 100 Thursdays now. "You reached out your hand to a man everyone else ran from, and it did not save me. It did something better. It showed me I was worth saving, and then it stepped back and let me do it myself. That is the greatest thing anyone has ever done for me, and I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of it." Tessa turned her hand over under his and held on. She thought about the girl she'd been 2 years ago. The exhausted waitress mocked for being cold, learning sign language alone in the dark. For a brother, the world had written off carrying everything by herself because there was no one else to carry it, invisible to everyone, used by anyone who thought her silence made her weak. That girl had walked into a private room expecting to be humiliated, and she had signed to a lonely man instead. And in doing so, she had discovered the one thing no one had ever told her, that her quiet was never weakness. Her quiet was strength, holding its breath, waiting for the moment it was needed. That the very thing they'd mocked her for, the thing they'd tried to use against her, the deaf brother and the learned language and the careful silence, was the exact thing that reached a man no one else in the world could reach. That everything she'd thought was her burden had been her gift all along. She had refused the money. She had refused the protection. She had refused to become a weapon. Refused revenge, refused every easy, dark shortcut a powerful man had laid at her feet. She had chosen dignity over destruction, truth over fear, the hard, clean path over the easy, dirty one, every single time, even when it cost her, even when it terrified her. And it had cost her nothing in the end. It had given her everything: a brother who was thriving, a job she'd earned, a world that was clean, and a friend and equal who had learned from her the most important thing a person can learn, which is that no one is only what the world decides they are. The co-workers had set up a poor waitress with a deaf mafia boss to humiliate her. That was the joke. That was how it began, in cruelty in a break room with a bet on who could film her breaking down first. They had been so certain they knew how it would end. They had been wrong about all of it. Wrong about her, wrong about him, wrong about what happens when you put two people the world has thrown away in a room together and expect them to break. Because the quiet ones are not weak. The feared ones are not always monsters. And a single act of kindness offered without pity and without fear to a person everyone else has given up on can turn a cruel joke into the truest thing either of them has ever known. Tessa Walker had walked into that room with nothing, and she had walked out with everything that mattered, and she had done it all without ever once betraying who she was. That was her victory. Not the man, not the money, not the promotion. The fact that she had gone through the fire and come out the other side still herself, still clean, still strong, still able to look her brother in the eye when he called her the strongest person he knew. And she was. She always had been. It just took the whole world trying to break her for her to finally believe it. 2 years after the Thursday that changed everything, Daniel Walker stood on a stage. He was 19 now, and he was not the frightened boy who'd come home with a black eye once, or the kid who'd learned to shrink his own dreams before his sister could disappoint him. He stood at a podium in front of 300 people in a hall rented by the community college, and he was about to give the closing address at the graduation ceremony for the advanced ASL program. He had been chosen by the deaf instructors, chosen by his peers, chosen because in 2 years he had become one of the brightest students the program had ever seen. And down in the front row in the seat he'd reserved for her sat the person he was about to talk about. Tessa didn't know he was going to talk about her. He'd kept it a secret the way she'd once kept so many secrets from the world, and she sat there in her one good dress, with her hands folded in her lap, so proud of him she could barely breathe, having no idea what was coming. Daniel raised his hands. An interpreter beside him spoke his signs aloud for the hearing members of the audience, but Daniel wasn't signing for them. He was signing for the deaf faces in the crowd, and for one hearing face in the front row that could read every word. When I was 4 years old, he signed, "A fever took my hearing. I don't remember the sound of anything. Not music, not my own name, not my mother's voice." He paused. "But I remember the silence after, and I remember being terrified of it. Because silence when you're a little kid and nobody around you knows how to reach you isn't peaceful. It's a cage. You're locked inside yourself, and everyone you love is on the outside. And you can see their mouths moving, and you can't get to them, and they can't get to you, and you start to believe you're going to be alone in there forever." The hall had gone completely still. Tessa felt her chest tighten. "There was one person who refused to leave me in that cage," Daniel signed. "She was 14 years old. She was a kid herself. And every night after our mother had given up, after the school had given up, after the whole world had decided a deaf kid wasn't worth the trouble, my sister sat on the edge of my bed and taught herself my language one sign at a time so that I would never be alone in the silence again." His hands slowed. She didn't have to. Nobody would have blamed her if she hadn't. She was exhausted. She was poor. She was carrying our whole broken family on her back. And she spent the hours she should have spent sleeping, learning how to say "I love you" with her hands so that a scared little boy wouldn't have to grow up in a cage. Tessa's vision blurred. She pressed her hand to her mouth. "For years, I thought I was the one she saved," Daniel signed. "And I was. But I want to tell you something I've learned standing here looking back at all of it. My sister didn't just teach herself sign language for me. She taught herself a whole way of seeing people. She learned to look at someone the world had thrown away, someone locked in a silence nobody else would enter. And she learned to walk into that silence and say, 'I see you. I'm here. You are not alone.'" He paused, and his eyes found Tessa's in the front row. "And she did it for me first, but she didn't stop with me. Because a person who learns to do that really learns. It doesn't just do it once. They do it for the rest of their life. They do it for anyone the world has decided to talk around. My sister has a gift, and the gift isn't sign language. The gift is that she refuses to let anyone be invisible, and I got to be the first person she ever gave it to." He had to stop for a moment. So did half the room. And Tessa sat in the front row and wept because her little brother had understood something about her that she'd never fully understood about herself. And he'd said it out loud in front of 300 people, and there was nothing invisible about her now. Nothing at all. "I'm going to be a teacher," Daniel signed when he could go on. "I'm going to teach deaf kids. And when I stand in front of a classroom full of children locked in the silence, I remember I'm going to walk into that silence with them the way my sister walked into mine. That's what I'm going to do with my life. And every single kid I reach, every single one is really her. It's her hands doing it through mine, because she taught me that no one is ever too far gone to reach. She proved it to me when I was 4, and she's been proving it ever since to people I'll never even know about." He looked at his sister, and he signed the last of it slowly, so she'd catch every word. "Tessa, you spent your whole life thinking you were just a waitress, thinking you were nobody, thinking the quiet meant you didn't matter. I need you to hear me. You are the reason I exist. You are the reason all these people got to know me. And every good thing I ever do in this world, for the rest of my life, is a thing you did because you refused to let one scared little boy be alone. That's not nobody, Tess. That's the most somebody a person can be." The hall erupted, not in the sound of clapping, though the hearing members clapped. In the deaf applause, 300 pairs of hands raised and twisting in the air, a silent storm of light and motion. The whole room shaking their hands toward the stage and toward the woman in the front row who had learned this exact gesture at 14 years old on the edge of a twin bed. Tessa stood up because her legs wouldn't let her stay sitting, and she raised her own hands and applauded her brother back, both of them crying, the whole room a sea of raised hands, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever been part of in her life. Afterward, in the crush of the reception, Daniel found her and pulled her into a hug that lasted a long time. When he let go, he signed, "There's someone here I want you to see. He came. I didn't think he would, but he came. He's in the back. He said he didn't want to make a thing of it." Tessa turned, and there, standing quietly against the far wall out of the way, dressed in a dark suit that fit. The way expensive things fit expensive people was Salvatore Marino. She hadn't invited him. She hadn't even told him about the graduation, because their Thursdays had a shape to them, a boundary she'd always kept the private room and nowhere else. But Daniel, it turned out, had invited him, and Salvatore had come. He stood there against the wall, this enormous man the whole city had once feared, and he was watching the room full of deaf people signing to each other with an expression on his face that Tessa had never seen there before, not in 2 years of Thursdays. He was watching a community, a whole room of people who moved through the world in his language, who understood each other without translation, who had never once made each other feel like less. He was seeing for the first time in his 60 years of life what it might have looked like if the world had reached into his silence instead of leaving him in it. And his face, that guarded, careful face that had spent 40 years reading rooms to know if he was safe, was doing something it had never learned how to do properly. It was simply openly feeling. Tessa crossed the room to him. "You came," she signed. "Your brother asked me," Salvatore signed. "He found a way to reach me. He is resourceful, that one, like his sister." His eyes went back to the room, to the sea of moving hands, to the laughter that had no sound and needed none. "I did not know," he signed slowly. "In 60 years, I did not know that this existed. A room like this, people like this. I spent my whole life believing the silence was a prison, a thing that happened to me that isolated me, that made me strange and frightening and alone." His hands paused. "And here is a whole room of people who live in the same silence, and it is not a prison for them. It is a home. They built a home inside the very thing I thought was a cage." He looked at her, and his eyes were wet. "How did I not know? How did I live 60 years and not know that the thing I hated most about myself could be a place where people belong? Because nobody ever showed you," Tessa signed gently. "Same as nobody showed you that you could be a person instead of a weapon. You had to wait 60 years for someone to walk into your silence and say hello. That's not your fault, Sal. That's just how alone you were." Salvatore looked at the room for a long time, and then he signed something that Tessa would carry with her for the rest of her days. "I want to help build more of these," he signed. "Rooms like this one, places where deaf children do not have to grow up believing the silence is a cage. I have been giving money quietly for 2 years. Interpreters, programs, small things. But this is what I want to give the rest of my life to. Not because I am trying to buy my way clean. You taught me that money cannot do that, and I believe you. But because I finally understand what I could have been given if someone had reached me when I was 9 years old and hurt and alone. Nobody reached me. I want to be the person who reaches the ones coming up behind me. I want no deaf child to wait 60 years to find a room like this." And Tessa understood that this finally was the whole shape of it. Everything that had happened, the cruel joke in the break room, the private room, the terrible offer, the refused money, the men in suits, the reckoning. All of it had been carrying them both toward this moment. Toward a man who'd spent his life as a weapon, discovering that his deepest wound could become the thing he used to heal others. Toward a woman who'd spent her life invisible, learning that the quiet thing she did in the dark for one boy could ripple out and change the world. Neither of them had been what the world decided they were, and in refusing to be, they had become something the world didn't have a name for. Daniel came and stood beside them, and the three of them watched the room together, the graduate and his sister and the man who had once been the most feared person in the city. 3 people the world had thrown away, standing in a room full of light and moving hands, none of them alone. "He's going to help me," Daniel signed to Tessa, nodding at Salvatore. "With the school I want to start. Someday. When I'm older and I've taught for a while. A school for deaf kids, where every single teacher signs, where no kid ever sits in a classroom feeling invisible." His face was shining. "He says he'll help me build it. Clean, Tess," he promised, "all the way clean, because he says you'd never forgive either of us if it wasn't." Tessa looked at Salvatore, and Salvatore looked back at her, and he signed, "Clean, every brick of it, on my word, and my word is the one thing in my life that was never for sale. You taught me the difference between the help that lifts a person up and the help that only holds them down. This help lifts. I promise you, this help lifts." And Tessa believed him, because she'd watched him change Thursday by Thursday from a man who solved problems by making people disappear into a man who wept in a graduation hall at the sight of children being reached. She'd watched him leave a world you don't leave, slowly, dangerously, all the way, because a waitress had shown him he was allowed to choose. She'd watched the most powerful man she'd ever known learn that the only power that was ever worth anything was the power to be good when being bad was easier. He wasn't going to put a single fingerprint on Daniel's dream that wasn't clean. She knew it the way she knew her own name. That night after the reception, after Daniel had gone off with his classmates to celebrate Tessa, and Salvatore stood outside the hall in the cool evening, and for a moment neither of them signed anything at all. They just stood in the quiet, the way they'd sat in the quiet 100 Thursdays now, two people who'd finally learned that quiet was never the enemy. "Can I tell you something?" Tessa signed finally. "Always." 2 years ago, I walked into that private room expecting the worst day of my life, she signed. Brett set it up to break me. Everyone was waiting to watch me fall apart. And I remember standing outside that oak door thinking, whatever happens in there, don't let them see it land. That was all I wanted. Just to survive it. Just to not give them the satisfaction. Her hands slowed. And instead I found you. And you found me. And two people who were supposed to be a cruel joke turned into the best thing that ever happened to either of us. She looked at him. "I keep thinking about how close I came to never opening that door, to calling in sick or quitting before Brett could ruin me, or just breaking down the way they wanted. I keep thinking about all the ways it could have gone where I never signed to you, where you sit alone in that room for another year, where Daniel never gets his program, where none of this exists." She shook her head. "And the only reason any of it happened is that I decided standing outside that door that I wasn't going to let them break me. That's it. That's the whole thing. One decision to keep my head up when everyone wanted it down." Salvatore was quiet for a moment. Then he signed, "That is not a small thing, Tessa. That is the only thing. Everything good in both our lives came from one moment when you refused to be broken. Do you understand how rare that is? Most people break. The world pushes and they fold, and who could blame them? But you did not fold. Not that night. Not any of the nights after when I offered you every easy dark way out and you refused all of them. You have been refusing to break your whole life. It is the truest thing about you." He paused. "And it saved a deaf man who did not know he was worth saving. It saved a boy who is going to save hundreds more. It is going to build a school. All of it from one girl outside a door deciding to keep her head up." He reached out and put his huge scarred hand on her shoulder, gentle, careful, the way he touched everything that mattered to him. "Do not ever believe again that you were nobody. You were never nobody. You were the strongest person in every room you ever walked into. It just took the rest of us a while to see it." Tessa reached up and put her hand over his, and they stood there like that in the quiet evening. Two people the world had tried to throw away, who had refused both of them to be thrown. The Thursdays continued for years. They always would. Long after Daniel became a teacher, long after the school broke ground on land, Salvatore bought clean and paid for clean, long after Tessa had become the kind of manager people transferred restaurants to work. Under the two of them, still met in that private room where a cruel joke had turned into the truest connection either of them had ever known. Sometimes they talked for an hour. Sometimes they just sat comfortable in the quiet. Two people who no longer needed to fill any silence because they'd both learned it was never empty to begin with. And every so often on those Thursdays, Tessa would catch Salvatore watching her hands the way he had that very first night with the wonder of a man who'd walked through the dark for 40 years and finally seen a light. And she'd think about the girl she'd been learning sign language alone on the edge of a twin bed, invisible to everyone, certain she was. Nobody certain. The quiet meant she didn't matter. That girl had no idea that the language she was teaching herself in the dark would one day reach the loneliest man in the city and pull him back into the human race. No idea that her careful quiet was strength holding its breath. No idea that every thankless hour she gave to a deaf little brother would ripple out across the years and become a school, a community, a whole future for children not yet born. The co-workers had set up a poor waitress with a deaf Mafia boss to humiliate her. They had been so sure they knew how it would end. They never could have imagined that it would end like this. with a graduation and a school breaking ground and a room full of hands raised in silent applause, with 2 thrown-away people who refused to break, and in refusing, built something the world didn't have a name for, out of nothing but honesty and courage, and the stubborn, unkillable decision to keep their heads up when everyone wanted them down. Tessa Walker had walked into that room with nothing, and she had turned it with her own 2 hands into everything. That was not a cruel joke. That was the truest thing that had ever happened. And it started all of it the moment one quiet woman decided that no one, not her brother, not a feared stranger, not a single soul the world had given up on was ever going to be invisible again.